I love skeleton watches, in principle at least. I loved the Zenith Defy El Primero, in principle at least. Zenith now released the Zenith Defy Skyline Skeleton. Do I still love it in principle, or do I love it? Zenith has two lines I pay attention to, the Chronomaster line and the Defy line. The Chronomaster line is where you find the models that harken back to the original El Primero lines, watches with a more classic aesthetic, and also, you know, the Chronomaster Sport, the watch people either love or hate. The latter primarily because of its in many ways striking, if not superficial, resemblance to the Daytona, ceramic bezel and all. The Defy line, on the other hand, is the not quite Hublot, but kind of Hublot aesthetic, with angular, aggressive, modern, or even, you know, futuristic designs. It's a love it or hate it aesthetic, and definitely not for everyone. There was the original Defy El Primero, which was a 44mm monster of a watch with a skeletonized dial and the key party feature being a stopwatch that times to 1/100th of a second, separate power supply and a very characteristic sound when running. The problem with it though was its huge size. Yeah, it sat reasonably well on the wrist for its size, but the dial is huge, it's tall and just a bit over the top. Like I said, very Hublot, albeit with a much better movement. Then there was the original Defy line. I loved those watches, especially the ceramic blue and the ceramic white. They seemed balanced, modern and unique, albeit maybe a little bit on the toy watch side and not an everyday watch, at least not for most people. They were, however, still a breath of fresh air in a world of sports dress casual watches dominated by the Aqua Terra, the Club Sport and the Datejusts of this world. Even the Defy in steel with blue dial, no skeleton was sufficiently different to the other offerings out there. Which brings me to the Skyline Skeleton. To be honest, I never really liked the Skyline, primarily because of the bezel that was too much like a Royal Oak or a Laureato. With the second dial at the 9 o'clock position and the date window at 6, the dial just didn't seem particularly thought out. Has the Skeleton redeemed the Defy line and the Skyline models? To some extent, yes. The case and bracelet are very much an integrated look. Compared to a Datejust or an Aqua Terra, the bracelet flows almost seamlessly from case to bracelet. This is primarily because of the flat angular design as opposed to the more curved and supple cases of the Datejusts and the Aqua Terras of this world. The brushing of the case lugs continues almost unimpeded onto the bracelet, which makes it a very sleek look. A minor complaint is the vertical gap between the lugs and the end link that break the flow ever so slightly, but you know, it is ever so slight. Sticking with a predominantly brushed case and bracelet is also a good choice. The bezel has polished edges, which gives a nice contrast to the overall industrial brushed aesthetic. Zenith has done a very good job. As for the dial, this is the signature feature of the watch because of the skeleton dial. Skeleton dials are ridiculously hard to do well aesthetically. They very easily come across as busy, cluttered and unreadable. Compromises on legibility often have to be made and the result can be jarring. Cartier's Santos Skeleton. Cool that it's transparent back to front, but seeing my skin through the case is just weird. Tag Heuer Monza Skeleton Chronometer. Realizing that the subdials would be unreadable, they go for a flat subdial. To improve legibility, they add blue hour markers, screaming white hands, and a red ring around the date indicator. Do you know what technically is the most legible contrast combination for writing? It's yellow on black. It's excellent for contrast, but it's terrible to read. There's a reason not all books are written as yellow on black. Same with the Monza. It does the job with the screaming blue on the black background, but it's ugly. The Piaget Skeleton. It's a good looking skeleton. It's unreadable because of the gloss blue and steel elements all around and a lack of actual dial. It's all movement and then hands. I honestly think that Zenith does some of the very best skeleton work out there, and the Skyline excels as well. Why? First of all layers keep the same tonal coherency. Movement components at the lower layers are primarily matted blues and matted dark grays. As you move up the layers, the components stay in the same color range, but become progressively less saturated. As opposed to the Monza, it actually gets less colorful and less saturated as you move up. Additionally, the top layer maintains the brushed style like the case. The blue is a matted deep blue. The second subdial is a desaturated black. Finally, simple polished steel hands with white lume. Zenith achieves contrast not by going for complementary colors or huge contrast, but rather subtle shifts, and it works really, really well. You never doubt that it's a skeletonized watch. It's impressively legible, but also subdued. I like it a lot. On the one hand, this is a steel sports watch like so many others, but there is no way on earth that this competes with the Datejust, the Santos or the Aqua Terra, all because of the skeletonized dial and the futuristic case and design. This watch competes with watches like the Bulgari Finismo in skeleton, or its Pro Pilot X, or on paper at least, the Tag Heuer Monza Chronometer Skeleton. It's tough though, because price-wise, not a lot of watches in this range compete, and for the level of finishing, this is a watch that competes with watches in the league of Piaget, Parmigiani and AP, and yet not. It kind of sits there all on its own. There are cheaper models out there, but they're nowhere nearly as good. The more expensive models are super niche and super hard to get a hold of. Which brings me to who it's for. Well, potentially it's for a person that really wants something different, either as a daily wearer that will function like a Datejust, but with a very personal style. It's far more likely that it's for a watch lover that has a case full of immaculate skeleton watches, 1/100th movements and whatnot. This watch is basically super niche, which is a shame, because if I were to suggest a skeleton watch to a person that has never bought a skeleton watch, this one would be very high up on the list because it's done so well. The reality though is that the biggest problem with this watch is not the skeleton dial. It's the Jetsons Star Trek industrial aesthetic. Ultimately, this is probably what will be the biggest turnoff for most. I wouldn't change it myself, but that's the reality, I think. What do you think? What are your thoughts on skeletonized dials? Comment below, and also like, subscribe, come back for more. Cheers.